so that no chance might be left for those from whom I had escaped to overtake me. It is now nearly 20 years since this happened, and more than 5 since I left the white settlement, which I might never probably have visited again had I not been called upon as a witness in a lawsuit which was pending in Kentucky, and which I really believe would never have been settled had I not come forward and established the beginning of a certain boundary line. The story is this, sir. Mr. moved from old Virginia into Kentucky, and having a large tract granted to him in the new state, laid claim to a certain parcel of land adjoining the Green River, and, as chance would have it, took for one of his corners the very ash tree on which I had made my mark, beginning, as it is expressed in the deed, at an ash marked by 3 distinct notches of the tomahawk of a white man. The tree had grown much, and the bark had covered the marks, but somehow or other Mr. had heard from some one all that I have already said to you, and thinking that I might remember the spot alluded to in the deed, but which was no longer discoverable, wrote for me to come and try at least to find the place or the tree. His letter mentioned that all my expenses should be paid, and not caring much about once more going back to Kentucky, I started and met Mr. After some conversation, the affair with the Indians came to my recollection. I considered for a while, and began to think that, after all, I could find the very spot, as well as the tree, if it were yet standing. Mr. and I mounted our horses, and off we went to the Green River bottoms. After some difficulty, for you must be aware, sir, that great changes have taken place in those woods, I found at last the spot where I had crossed the river, and waiting for the moon to rise, made for the course in which I thought the ash trees grew. On approaching the place, I felt as if the Indians were there still, and as if I were still a prisoner among them. Mr. and I camped near what I conceived the spot, and waited until the return of day. At the rising of the sun I was on foot, and after a good deal of musing, thought that an ash tree then in sight must be the very one on which I had made my mark. I felt as if there could be no doubt about it, and mentioned my thought to Mr. "Well, Colonel Boone," said he, "if you think so, I hope that it may prove true, but we must have some witnesses. Do you stay hereabouts, and I will go and bring back some of the settlers whom I know." I agreed. Mr. trotted off, and I, to pass the time, rambled about to see if a deer was still living in the land. But ah, sir, what a wonderful difference 30 years makes in a country! Why, at the time when I was caught by the Indians, you would not have walked out in any direction more than a mile without shooting a buck or a bear. There were then thousands of buffaloes on the hills in Kentucky. The land looked as if it never would become poor, and to hunt in those days was a pleasure indeed. But when I was left to myself on the banks of the Green River, I dare say for the last time in my life, a few signs only of the deer were seen, and as to a deer itself, I saw none. Mr. returned, accompanied by 3 gentlemen. They looked upon me as if I had been Washington himself, and walked to the ash tree, which I now call my own, as if in quest of a long lost treasure. I took an axe from one of them, and cut a few chips off the bark. Still no signs were to be seen, so I cut again until I thought it time to be cautious, and I scraped and worked away with my butcher knife until I did come to where my tomahawk had left an impression on the wood. We now went regularly to work, and scraped at the tree with care until 3 hacks, as plain as any 3 notches ever were, could be seen. Mr. and the other gentlemen were astonished, and I must allow that I was as much surprised as pleased myself. I made affidavit of this remarkable occurrence in presence of these gentlemen. Mr. gained his cause. I left Green River for ever, and came to where we are now, and, sir, I wish you a good night. The life of this wonderful man was filled with similar adventures, many of which can now never be recalled. The following narrative will give the reader an idea of the scenes which were continually occurring in those bloody conflicts between the white settlers and the Indians. A widow was residing in a lonely log cabin, remote from any settlers, in what is now Bourbon County, Kentucky. Her lonely hut consisted of but 2 rooms. One the aged widow occupied herself, with 2 sons and a widowed daughter with an infant child. The other was tenanted by her 3 unmarried daughters, the oldest of whom was 20 years of age. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the members of the industrious family in their lonely habitation had retired, with the exception of one of the daughters and one of the sons, who was keeping her company. Some indications of danger had alarmed the young man, though he kept his fears to himself. The cry apparently of owls in an adjoining forest was heard, answering each other in a rather unusual way. The horses in the enclosure by the side of the house, who seemed to have an instinct informing them of the approach of the Indians, seemed much excited and galloped around snorting with terror. Soon steps were heard in the yard, and immediately several loud knocks were made at the door, with some one inquiring, in good English, "Who keeps this house?" The young man very imprudently was just unbarring the door when the mother sprang from the bed, exclaiming that they were Indians. The whole family was immediately aroused, and the young men seized their guns. The Indians now threw off all disguise, and began to thunder at the door, endeavoring to break it down. Through a loophole prepared for such an emergency, a rifle shot, discharged at the savages, compelled a precipitate retreat. Soon, however, they cautiously returned, and attacking the other end of the cabin, where they found a point not exposed to the fire from within, they succeeded at length in breaking through, and entered the room occupied by the 3 girls. One of them they seized and bound. Her sister made desperate resistance, and stabbed one of the Indians to the heart with a large knife which she was using at the loom. They immediately tomahawked her, and she fell dead upon the floor. The little girl in the gloom of midnight they had overlooked. The poor little thing ran out of the door, and might have escaped had she not, in her terror, lost all self-control, and ran around the house wringing her hands and crying bitterly. The brothers, agonized by the cries of their little sisters, were just about opening the door to rush out to her rescue, when their more prudent mother declared that the child must be abandoned to its fate, that any attempt to save her would not only be unavailing, but would ensure the certain destruction of them all. Just then the child uttered a most frantic scream. They heard the dull sound as of a tomahawk falling upon the brain. There were a few convulsive moans, and all again was silent. It was but too evident to all what these sounds signified. Presently the crackling of flames was heard, and through the portholes could be seen the glare of the rising conflagration, while the shouts of the savages grew more exultant. They had set fire to the end of the building occupied by the daughters. The logs were dry as tinder, and the devouring element was soon enveloping the whole building in its fatal embrace. To remain in the cabin was certain death, in its most appalling form. In rushing out, there was a bare possibility that some might escape. There was no time for reflection. The hot stifling flames and smothering smoke were rolling in upon them, and when they opened the door and rushed out into the outer air, endeavoring as soon as possible to reach the gloom of the forest. The old lady, aided by her eldest son, ran in one direction towards a fence, while the other daughter, with her infant in her arms, accompanied by the younger of the brothers, ran in another direction. The fire was blazing so fiercely as to shed all around the light of day. The old lady had just reached the fence when several rifle balls pierced her body, and she fell dead. Her son almost miraculously escaped, and leaping the fence, plunged into the forest and disappeared. The other party was pursued by the Indians with loud yells. Throwing down their guns, which they had discharged, the savages rushed upon the young man and his sister with their gleaming tomahawks. Gallantly the brother defended his sister, firing upon the savages as they came rushing on, and then assailing them with the butt of his musket, which he wielded with the fury of despair. He fought with such Herculean strength as to draw the attention of all the savages upon himself, and thus gave his sister an opportunity of escaping. He soon, however, fell beneath their tomahawks, and was in the morning found scalped and mangled in the most shocking manner.